Thank you. Sorry about that little pause there. Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you to the organizers and to all of you for being here today. And thank you to Phyllis and Jackson for your really excellent remarks on how and why we need to demilitarize and what US militarism looks like today. I'm going to talk, of course, about our budget, our federal budget, and how it enables this militarism and what we can do about that. So we need to demilitarize, but we also need to recognize that in our domestic politics here in the US, where we have the world's biggest military budget by far, and are a source of much of the world's, as Phyllis pointed out, weapons and misinformation, as Jackson pointed out, and all the other effects of our militarism. We need to focus on what enables all of that, which is our military budget. And we also need to focus on our domestic politics and the fight that we have in our domestic politics between investing in that military and militarism and between investing in domestic needs, which Jackson mentioned as one of his factors, and I'm going to talk about quite a bit more. So in the US, we have escaped austerity politics largely for the last few years during the pandemic, but it's coming back. And we're going to hear more calls for cutting budgets. That is going to put more pressure on the entire budget. But as we've seen time and time again, the Pentagon budget tends to be something that escapes a lot of that pressure. Over the last 10 years, we also had something called, ending in 2021, we had something called the Budget Control Act, which, without going into all of the details, one of the provisions of that act was a lockstep between military and domestic spending, so that in order to get more domestic spending, there had to be more military spending always. And a lot of that politics, even though the Budget Control Act itself expired in 2021, a lot of that same politics has kind of been locked in place now. And so we're seeing that same dynamic with every year's budget in Congress. So, for example, the Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act that the Biden administration championed and that passed Congress, those have good amounts of funding for their priorities, but that funding will expire. But by contrast, even though the Pentagon is funded on a year-to-year basis, those increases tend not to expire. Those increases tend to persist and be added to year after year. So even though we're supposed to just have a Pentagon budget for 1 year, and these other things are supposed to be time limited, that's not how it works in practice. And what that means, of course, is that Pentagon and military spending tends to just go endlessly up over time, and domestic spending does not do that. Now, of course, we all know that Democratic leadership, as Jackson pointed out, they typically haven't taken our side on a lot of these issues. And some of the reasons for that are familiar. We know they don't want to look soft. We know that they want to make sure that they're seen as equally tough on whatever opponent it may be at the given moment. We know that there are pressures from the industry, which are huge. There are more industry lobbyists for the military industry than there are members of Congress. We know that there is immense pressure to create jobs in this industry, all of those things. But there's also what I just referred to, which is this instinct to give away more military spending in order to get more domestic spending. And this is a really real dynamic. This is something that even pulls in progressives in Congress, folks who otherwise are voting these days or voting no on things like the military budget when it's alone, will still agree to pass higher military spending if it's attached to more domestic spending. So that's a problem that we have. And we need to kind of face that as part of our problem, and recognize that we need to be explicitly asking for that not to happen, explicitly asking that we aren't going to trade this anymore. So that's kind of the backdrop, and that's especially relevant to the moment where we are right now, which is we're in an omnibus budget moment. The fiscal year 2023 budget has not passed yet. Congress is working on it as we speak. A lot of that is happening behind doors. One thing we just heard this week is that House and Senate leaders have apparently agreed to an $847 billion military budget for the coming year. That is a huge amount. It is more than $100 billion higher than when Trump left office. And that doesn't include direct money for the Ukraine war. That doesn't include Ukraine money. So you can't blame it on that. So that's a huge increase under a Democratic president and over the last couple of years with Democratic control of both the House and Senate. And that's kind of what we're facing right now. Then you have the fact that there's sort of all of these actors are participating, the Biden administration, the House, the Senate. But the increase that the House and Senate just agreed to over even what Biden requested for the Pentagon this year is $45 billion. That would be enough to enact the childcare and preschool parts of the Build Back Better Act that were dropped when Senator Manchin opposed it. And again, this is supposed to be for 1 year, but we know how this works. When the Pentagon gets an increase, it tends to hang on to it and even add to it. So this is, again, we're being told we can't afford certain things, we can't afford other things. It's also that single year increase is more than twice what it would cost on an annual basis to continue the child tax credit that Phil has referred to that cut child poverty in half. So we're trading away terrible things domestically when we're agreeing to fund the Pentagon at this level. And even though they've just agreed to $847 billion, the whole deal's not done yet, which means it could still go higher. So that's what we're looking at right now. And more than half of the discretionary budget that Congress is working on right now will likely be military. We don't have final numbers on this yet, but this is what happens every year, and there's no reason to expect it to be different. So that's more than half goes to the military. But US militarism isn't just the Pentagon and nuclear weapons. It's not just the military. It's also militarism inside our borders. And we need to kind of stop thinking of it as completely separate. These are functions that are in separate agencies. And yes, the Pentagon operates outside of the US, but so do a lot of our domestic military agencies. You know, we have an FBI that operates internationally. The Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Bureau acts internationally. We have lots of militarized agencies like that that are acting both inside and outside of US borders. And we need to stop differentiating or we need to stop believing the differentiation that we're being fed about what's, you know, that we need to look at what's outside of our borders versus inside of our borders. So once you include the full what the Biden administration and what has been legislatively called security, not just national security, but security. That includes the Pentagon, it includes nuclear weapons, it includes spending on veterans, which even though we may not oppose that spending, the only reason it's necessary at the level it is because we have so many veterans and we send so many people to war. And then spending in the Department of Homeland Security, which is a military agency. In large part. If you exclude FEMA, most of the Department of Homeland Security is ICE and the border control, and those are militarized agencies. The Border Patrol is one of the world's largest police forces. So if you include all of that, then it gets up to fully 2/3 of our annual discretionary budget that goes to these things. We have only $1 in $3 left for things like childcare or healthcare or education or any of the other priorities that we need. So we're just throwing this money away, and it's not available for anything else that we need it to do. Now, we know, again, ordinary factors that are kind of pushing politically inside of our country for more military spending. You know, there's fear, there's militarism, there's US exceptionalism, there are jobs. All of those are real factors. But right now, there are three kind of particularly timely factors that are pushing for higher military spending. One of them is the Ukraine war. And it's important that we not just look at the money that's being directly allocated for the Ukraine war when we look at that, because it's also being used to push the entire Pentagon budget higher. Things that explicitly, officially have nothing to do with Ukraine are being pushed as well based on the Ukraine war as a justification. So we need to look more broadly when we think about that. And even though we know that, the US military budget is already 12 times that of Russia, so clearly more spending is not the answer, even if we did want to go head to head, which we don't. The second reason is China. Well, I don't think many of us want a direct U.S.-Russia war on this call. I realize there are various takes on what their U.S. role should be. The second reason is China, and this has been stoked also by the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because they're in the Pentagon elite, there is very much focus on the possibility of a China invasion of Taiwan. And so that's another place where that's coming from. And it's also coming from all this economic anxiety about China, right? And cultural and racist anxiety about China that we have in the United States. And the third thing is inflation, because the Pentagon argues that it's suffering from inflation just like the rest of us. The truth is that it's not. It's experiencing very different inflation from the rest of us, because as you can imagine, the Pentagon buys very different things from the rest of us. And so they're not experiencing the same inflation. And so far, there's been no sign that inflation is actually impacting the Pentagon in a serious way. And so therefore, it doesn't need a budget raise based on that. So there are arguments that we can make back against all of these things. But all of this kind of points us to what we need to be doing. One is that we need to be having, because militarism is not just the Pentagon, it's not just the Department of Energy, it's not just these agencies, it's not just outside of our borders. We need to be building stronger ties with anti-militarism movements more broadly. And that includes defund ICE and defund the police campaigns, all of these divest campaigns that want us to take money away from militarism and put it into human needs. And we're building those ties. And we were part of, for example, this summer of a convening between groups across different silos of this sort of militarism, including policing, including war and peace groups, including immigrant right groups. So we're starting to build those relationships and not just talk about the issues, how the issues are tied, but actually build real flesh and blood or virtual relationships between people in the movements so that we can really work together. And that's work that is crucial, and it's work that takes time. So that's something that has been happening for the last couple of years and is starting to show some progress. Another thing that's been mentioned also is links to the climate movement, and not just for the US as an emitter of fossil fuels, or for the US military as an emitter of fossil fuels, but also for the crucial point that Jackson made about the fact that we need diplomacy and we need to cut back on tensions between, especially the US and China, which are the world's two biggest emitters. There's no solution to climate change unless these two countries both participate fully. So that's another place. And then finally, I'll just mention the People Over Pentagon Act, which is a piece of legislation from Barbara Lee and Mark Pocan that has now about 30 co-sponsors. And that's to cut the Pentagon budget by over $100 billion. And it's a terrific organizing tool. It's something, the more co-sponsors we can get, the more people we can get to support it, the more we have a base in Congress for actually beginning to get close to where we could cut Pentagon spending for real. And as one example of that, the House voted this summer to revert on whether or not to reverse the amount that the House Armed Services Committee had added to the Biden Pentagon budget, and got 150 votes to reverse that increase. So we need to take our things like that where we have something to build from and really work on building on that piece by piece. And it's slow work and it's painstaking work, but you can see a path from 150 to 218. So that's where we need to be putting a lot of our efforts as well. And I'll stop there.